There exists within every human psyche a force so subtle, so hidden from conscious awareness, yet so devastatingly powerful that it can destroy the very relationships you treasure most while you remain completely unaware of your role in their destruction. This is not conscious cruelty or deliberate malice, but something far more insidious and tragic: the shadow, operating through you like an invisible puppeteer, compelling you to hurt the ones you love in ways that feel justified, necessary, even protective in the moment, yet leave a trail of wounded hearts and damaged connections that you cannot understand or explain. Jung understood what most people refuse to acknowledge: that we do not hurt those closest to us despite our love for them, but because of our unconscious relationship with the rejected parts of ourselves that we cannot bear to see, accept, or integrate. The shadow contains everything about yourself that you have deemed unacceptable: your anger, your selfishness, your neediness, your jealousy, your cruelty, your weakness, all the human qualities that you have banished from your conscious self-image and stuffed into the dark basement of your psyche, where they continue to live and breathe and influence your behavior in ways you never intended. The cruel irony is that the people we love most become the primary targets of our shadow projections, precisely because they are the ones who matter enough to trigger our deepest fears, our most primitive defenses, our most carefully hidden vulnerabilities. With strangers and acquaintances, we can maintain our polished personas, our socially acceptable masks, our carefully controlled presentations of who we think we should be. But with those we love, the stakes are higher, the intimacy deeper, the threat to our psychological defenses more profound, and so the shadow emerges with all its unconscious destructiveness. This invisible saboteur operates through what I call projection as persecution. We unconsciously locate in our loved ones the very qualities we cannot acknowledge in ourselves, then punish them for possessing what we refuse to own. The person who has banished their own anger becomes hypercritical of their partner's irritability. The individual who has rejected their own neediness becomes contemptuous of their friend's dependency. The one who has disowned their own selfishness becomes judgmental of their family members' self-care. We become the prosecutors of our own disowned aspects, using those we love as convenient screens onto which we can project and then attack the parts of ourselves we find most threatening. The shadow also operates through what Jung called the return of the repressed, the tendency for whatever we have pushed out of consciousness to emerge in our relationships in distorted, exaggerated, and destructive forms. The person who prides themselves on being patient explodes in unexpected rage at their loved ones. The individual who sees themselves as generous becomes suddenly petty and withholding in intimate relationships. The one who believes themselves to be understanding becomes harsh and judgmental with those closest to them. These eruptions feel alien, out of character, bewildering, but they are actually the inevitable result of psychological material that has been denied expression finally forcing its way into consciousness. Perhaps most tragically, the shadow's influence creates what I call intimacy punishment. The unconscious tendency to hurt those who dare to see us clearly, to get close enough to threaten our carefully constructed self-image, to love us in ways that demand authenticity rather than performance. We punish them for their love by showing them our worst selves, for their acceptance by testing it to destruction, for their loyalty by betraying it in small and large ways. We hurt them not because we don't love them, but because their love terrifies us by demanding that we become real rather than remaining safely hidden behind our personas. The invisible saboteur also works through defensive wounding. When someone gets close enough to see our vulnerabilities, our automatic response is often to wound them before they can wound us, to reject them before they can reject us, to abandon them before they can abandon us. This preemptive strike feels like self-protection, but actually destroys the very connections we most desperately want to preserve. We become our own worst enemies in love, sabotaging our relationships through the very mechanisms we believe are protecting them. The shadow's influence is particularly destructive because it operates through what appears to be virtue. We hurt our loved ones while convinced we are helping them, harm them while believing we are protecting them, diminish them while thinking we are improving them. The shadow is cunning enough to disguise its destructiveness as care, its cruelty as concern, its rejection as tough love. This makes it nearly impossible to recognize or interrupt because it feels so righteous, so justified, so necessary in the moment of its expression. The ways we hurt those we love are so varied, so subtle, so perfectly calibrated to their specific vulnerabilities that it seems almost as if our unconscious minds possess a malevolent intelligence designed to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Jung understood that this unconscious cruelty is not random, but follows predictable patterns, operating through psychological mechanisms so sophisticated that we can wound those closest to us with surgical precision while maintaining our self-image as loving, caring, well-intentioned people. One of the most devastating forms of unconscious cruelty is what I call selective blindness. The shadow's ability to make us suddenly unable to see our loved one's pain, needs, or vulnerabilities when acknowledging them would require us to confront something uncomfortable about ourselves. The partner who becomes mysteriously oblivious to their spouse's obvious distress because seeing it would mean acknowledging their own role in causing it. The parent who fails to notice their child's emotional needs because recognizing them would require examining their own unhealed childhood wounds. We develop an unconscious capacity to not see what we don't want to see, to not hear what we don't want to hear, to not feel what we don't want to feel about our impact on those we claim to love. Another form of shadow-driven cruelty manifests as empathy withdrawal, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of our normal capacity for understanding and compassion when our loved ones most need it. The person who is usually kind and understanding becomes harsh and judgmental precisely when their partner is most vulnerable. The typically empathetic friend becomes cold and dismissive when their loved one needs support. This withdrawal happens because their pain, their need, their vulnerability triggers something in our own shadow that we cannot tolerate. So we unconsciously punish them for making us feel what we refuse to feel. The shadow also expresses its cruelty through timing attacks, the unconscious tendency to criticize, withdraw, or create conflict at precisely the moments when our loved ones are most vulnerable, most in need of support, most requiring our presence and care. We pick fights just before important events, withdraw affection when they need it most, create drama during their moments of triumph or crisis. This timing is not accidental, but precisely calculated by the unconscious to inflict maximum emotional damage when defenses are lowest and the wound will cut deepest. Perhaps most insidiously, the shadow operates through virtue-signaling cruelty, using our supposed moral superiority, spiritual evolution, or psychological insight as weapons against those we love. We become experts at diagnosing their flaws while remaining blind to our own. We offer helpful observations about their character defects while denying our own. We position ourselves as the evolved one, the healthy one, the conscious one, and use this position to subtly diminish, correct, and improve them in ways that feel like love but function like slow poison. The shadow's cruelty also manifests through conditional love withdrawal, the unconscious tendency to make our affection, attention, and approval contingent upon our loved ones behaving in ways that don't threaten our psychological comfort zones. We love them when they make us feel good about ourselves, and withdraw when they reflect back aspects of ourselves we don't want to see. This creates what amounts to emotional blackmail. Be who we need you to be to maintain our self-image or experience the withdrawal of our love. Another devastating pattern is what I call projection reversal. We unconsciously transfer our own unacceptable impulses, feelings, and characteristics onto our loved ones, then attack them for possessing qualities that are actually our own. The controlling person accuses their partner of being controlling. The selfish individual criticizes their friend for being self-centered. The emotionally unavailable person condemns their loved one for being distant. We make them the container for our own shadow material, then punish them for carrying what we refuse to own. The shadow also employs gaslighting through care, making our loved ones question their own perceptions, feelings, and experiences while maintaining that we are only trying to help them. We convince them that their emotional responses are overreactions, their needs are unreasonable, their perceptions are distorted, all while presenting ourselves as the voice of reason and reality. This form of cruelty is particularly devastating because it undermines their trust in their own inner guidance, while making resistance to our influence seem like evidence of their irrationality. Most tragically, the shadow operates through love as possession. We begin to treat those we love as extensions of ourselves rather than as autonomous beings with their own rights, needs, and destinies. We control them while calling it protection, limit them while calling it care, diminish them while calling it love. We cannot tolerate their independence because it threatens our psychological fusion with them, so we unconsciously work to keep them small, dependent, and manageable, while convincing ourselves and them that this is what love looks like. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of shadow-driven harm is how it perpetuates itself across generations, creating what Jung recognized as ancestral complexes that pass from parent to child like psychological DNA, ensuring that the same patterns of unconscious cruelty repeat through family lineages with devastating precision. The parent who was criticized mercilessly as a child grows up to criticize their own children mercilessly, convinced they are helping them improve. The individual who was emotionally abandoned recreates emotional abandonment in their own relationships while believing they are protecting their independence. We become unwitting carriers of generational wounds, transmitting to those we love most the very traumas that shaped our own psychology. This transmission occurs through what I call trauma inheritance. Children absorb not just their parents' conscious teachings, but their unconscious patterns, their unresolved shadows, their unlived emotional material. The child learns to fear what the parent fears, reject what the parent rejects, and develop the same defensive strategies that the parent used to survive their own childhood wounds. The parent's shadow becomes the template for the child's shadow, creating a psychological legacy that can persist for generations until someone finally develops enough consciousness to recognize and interrupt the pattern. The generational shadow operates through unconscious reenactment, each generation recreating the same fundamental dynamics that wounded them, but in slightly different forms that make the repetition difficult to recognize. The parent who felt unseen as a child fails to truly see their own child. The individual who felt controlled becomes controlling. The person who felt criticized becomes critical. We replay our family's psychological themes, like actors in a play we never consciously chose to perform, inflicting on our loved ones variations of the same wounds we ourselves received. This inheritance manifests most clearly in what Jung called family complexes, autonomous psychological patterns that operate through family systems like invisible forces, compelling family members to play specific roles in repeating dramas that began generations before they were born. The family scapegoat who carries everyone's disowned shame. The family savior who exhausts themselves trying to heal everyone's wounds. The family rebel who acts out everyone's repressed anger. These roles feel like conscious choices, but are actually unconscious assignments that maintain the family's psychological homeostasis, while ensuring that no one individual has to face the full weight of the family's accumulated shadow material. The most insidious aspect of generational transmission is what I call normalized dysfunction. patterns of harm that become so familiar within family systems that they are perceived as normal, even loving expressions. The family where criticism is mistaken for caring, where control is confused with protection, where emotional withholding is seen as strength, where boundary violations are interpreted as intimacy. Children growing up in these systems learn that love includes a certain amount of harm, that care involves a degree of control, that intimacy requires a sacrifice of selfhood. Generational shadows also create what Jung recognized as loyalty conflicts, the unconscious belief that healing your own wounds would somehow betray your family lineage, that becoming healthier than your parents would constitute a form of abandonment or superiority. The child feels guilty for being happier than their depressed parent, for setting boundaries their parent never learned to set, for developing emotional skills their family never possessed. This guilt often sabotages personal growth and perpetuates dysfunctional patterns out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. The shadow transmission process is particularly powerful because it operates through emotional contagion. Children absorb their parents' unprocessed emotions as if they were their own. The parents' ungrieved losses become the child's unexplained sadness. The parent's disowned anger becomes the child's inexplicable rage. The parent's unacknowledged fear becomes the child's chronic anxiety. The child becomes a living container for the parent's shadow material, carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to bear, but which feel entirely personal and authentic. Perhaps most tragically, this generational transmission creates what I call wound worship, family systems that organize their entire identity around their collective trauma, their shared dysfunction, their inherited patterns of harm. The family pride themselves on being survivors, while never actually healing from what they survived. They bond through their mutual damage rather than through their mutual growth, creating a psychological culture where healing feels like betrayal and health feels like abandonment of family identity. The generational shadow also perpetuates itself through selective awareness. Each generation becomes expert at seeing the dysfunction in previous generations, while remaining blind to their own variations of the same patterns. They correctly identify their parents' controlling behavior while missing their own need to control. They recognize their grandparents' emotional unavailability while denying their own intimacy fears. This selective awareness creates the illusion of progress while maintaining the essential dysfunction in new and improved forms. Within every intimate relationship exist what Jung would have recognized as psychological landmines, specific triggers that activate our shadow with such force that we temporarily become different people, abandoning our normal capacity for love, understanding, and compassion in favor of unconscious cruelty that feels justified in the moment but leaves lasting damage in its wake. These trigger points are not random, but precisely calibrated to our deepest wounds, our most carefully hidden vulnerabilities, our most defended psychological territories. Understanding these triggers is crucial because they represent the moments when love transforms into harm with devastating swiftness. One of the most common trigger points is what I call abandonment activation, when our loved one's behavior threatens our deepest fears of being left, rejected, or deemed unworthy of love. The shadow responds to this perceived threat with preemptive strikes designed to push the other person away before they can leave us, to reject them before they can reject us, to prove that we don't need them before they can prove that they don't need us. We become cruel precisely when we most need to be vulnerable, attacking exactly when we most need to ask for reassurance. Another devastating trigger is control threat response, when our loved ones assert their independence, set boundaries, or make choices that don't align with our needs or expectations. The shadow interprets any assertion of autonomy as a challenge to our authority, a threat to our security, or evidence that they don't love us enough to prioritize our comfort. We respond with guilt, manipulation, emotional withdrawal, criticism, or outright attempts to override their autonomy, while convincing ourselves that we are protecting the relationship or helping them make better decisions. The shadow also activates through what Jung called projection reversal triggers, moments when our loved ones display qualities or behaviors that mirror our own disowned aspects too precisely for comfort. We become enraged when they show the anger we've repressed, disgusted when they display the neediness we've rejected, contemptuous when they reveal the vulnerability we've hidden. Their authentic expression becomes a mirror that reflects our own denied humanity, and the shadow responds by attacking the mirror rather than acknowledging what it shows us about ourselves. Perhaps most destructively, the shadow emerges through intimacy panic responses, when someone gets close enough to see our real selves beneath our carefully constructed personas. The closer they get to our authentic wounds, our genuine needs, our actual limitations, the more threatened the shadow becomes, and the more likely we are to wound them in ways designed to create distance. We hurt them for loving us too well, punish them for seeing us too clearly, reject them for accepting us too completely. The shadow also activates through success and happiness triggers, when our loved ones experience joy, achievement, or fulfillment that we unconsciously believe we don't deserve, or that highlights our own sense of inadequacy. Instead of celebrating their happiness, we find ways to diminish it, criticize it, or create drama that redirects attention back to problems and pain. We cannot tolerate their light because it illuminates our own darkness, so we unconsciously work to dim their brightness rather than address our own shadows. Another common trigger point is need activation, when our loved ones express needs that feel too similar to our own disowned needs, or too threatening to our self-image as independent, strong, or self-sufficient. We respond to their vulnerability with criticism rather than compassion, to their requests for support with irritation rather than care, to their emotional needs with judgment rather than understanding. Their neediness triggers our shame about our own needs, and the shadow protects us from this shame by attacking them for having what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The shadow also emerges through loyalty test triggers, moments when we unconsciously test our loved one's commitment by behaving in ways designed to see if they will stay despite our worst behaviors. We create unnecessary conflicts, manufacture crises, act out in dramatic ways, all to test whether their love is conditional or unconditional. These tests inevitably damage the very relationships they are designed to protect, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where our fear of abandonment leads to behaviors that cause abandonment. Perhaps most tragically, the shadow activates through healing resistance triggers, when our loved ones' growth, healing, or positive changes threaten the psychological equilibrium we've established in the relationship. We unconsciously sabotage their progress, create distractions from their development, or escalate our own problems to redirect attention away from their healing. We cannot tolerate their evolution because it highlights our own stagnation and threatens the familiar dynamics that have defined our connection, even when those dynamics are unhealthy. We arrive now at the most crucial threshold in the journey of conscious loving, the recognition that until we turn toward our shadow with the same devotion we bring to loving others, we will continue to wound those we cherish most through the very mechanisms we believe are protecting them. The path to loving without harm requires what Jung called the integration of the shadow, not the elimination of our darker aspects, but their conscious acknowledgement, acceptance, and transformation into allies rather than enemies of love. This is perhaps the most challenging work a human being can undertake, but it is also the most liberating, for it frees us to love authentically rather than defensively. Shadow integration begins with what I call radical self-honesty, the willingness to acknowledge the ways we have hurt those we love, not through conscious malice, but through unconscious patterns that we have been too frightened or too ashamed to examine. This requires abandoning the comfortable story that we are good people who occasionally make mistakes, and embracing the more complex truth that we are human beings capable of both profound love and unconscious cruelty, often in the same moment, often toward the same people. The process demands what Jung called withdrawing projections, learning to recognize when we are seeing in our loved ones what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, when we are criticizing them for qualities we possess but cannot own, when we are punishing them for being mirrors of our own disowned aspects. This withdrawal is not a cognitive exercise, but an emotional earthquake that requires us to reclaim responsibility for our own shadow material, rather than making others carry the burden of our unintegrated darkness. Shadow integration also requires developing what I call emotional archaeology, the patient excavation of our own triggers, patterns, and reactive responses to understand their origins in our personal history, rather than projecting them onto our current relationships. When we explode in rage at our partner's lateness, we must ask not, "Why are they so inconsiderate?" but "What wound from my past is being activated by this situation?" When we withdraw emotionally from our child's neediness, we must explore not their excessive demands, but our own unhealed relationship with dependency and care. Perhaps most challenging is learning what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, developing the capacity to contain both our love and our cruelty, our generosity and our selfishness, our desire to connect and our impulse to withdraw, without acting out either extreme or projecting one side onto our loved ones. This means learning to say, "I am feeling angry and I love you," rather than either suppressing the anger or expressing it destructively. It means acknowledging, "I want to control you because I'm scared," rather than either controlling or pretending the desire doesn't exist. The integration process also involves what I call conscious repair, taking responsibility for the harm we have caused through our unconscious patterns and making amends not just through apologies, but through genuine behavioral change. This means learning to recognize our triggers before they activate, developing strategies for pausing when we feel our shadow emerging, and creating accountability systems that help us choose conscious responses rather than unconscious reactions. Shadow integration in love requires developing differentiated intimacy, the capacity to be close to others without losing ourselves, to love deeply without merging destructively, to care profoundly without controlling compulsively. This means learning to tolerate our loved ones' autonomy even when it triggers our abandonment fears, to support their growth even when it highlights our own stagnation, to celebrate their happiness even when it activates our own sense of unworthiness. Perhaps most beautifully, integrated shadow work transforms our relationships from unconscious battlegrounds where we fight our own demons through the bodies and hearts of those we love into conscious partnerships where our darkness becomes a source of depth rather than destruction. When we own our shadows, we stop needing others to carry them. When we integrate our disowned aspects, we stop projecting them onto our loved ones. When we make peace with our own complexity, we can love others' complexity rather than demanding their perfection. The goal is not to become perfect lovers who never cause harm, but to become conscious lovers who recognize our capacity for harm and choose differently, who understand our triggers and develop healthier responses, who own our shadows and transform them into wisdom rather than weapons. The integrated person loves not from the fantasy of their own goodness, but from the reality of their own wholeness, creating relationships that can contain both light and darkness while choosing to express love rather than fear, connection rather than control, growth rather than stagnation. Your shadow is not your enemy, but your teacher. Not your shame, but your strength waiting to be reclaimed. Not your curse, but your capacity for depth, authenticity, and ultimately love that includes rather than excludes, heals rather than harms, liberates rather than controls. The ones you love are waiting for you to do this work, not because they need you to be perfect, but because they deserve to be loved by someone who is whole. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, if you see the ways your shadow has been hurting those you love most, then your transformation begins with the most difficult admission any loving person can make. I have been unconsciously harmful to those I care about, and I am ready to do the work to change. This is not self-attack, but self-awareness, not shame, but courage, not weakness, but the beginning of real strength. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to do the deep shadow work that transforms unconscious harm into conscious love. Share this video with someone brave enough to examine their own patterns of hurting those they love, because this work requires witnessing, support, and accountability. And most importantly, start today. Identify one pattern you recognize from this exploration. Maybe it's your tendency to withdraw when your partner needs you most, or your habit of criticizing when you feel threatened, or your compulsion to control when you feel scared. Make a commitment to pause the next time you feel this pattern activating. Take a breath. Ask yourself, what is my shadow trying to protect me from right now? What would love do instead of fear? Your relationships are not doomed to repeat these patterns forever. Your shadow is not a life sentence, but an invitation to consciousness. Your capacity to harm is also your capacity to heal once you own it, understand it, and transform it through awareness. The people you love don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be conscious. They don't need you to never have a shadow. They need you to have a relationship with your shadow that serves love rather than fear. Stop hurting the ones you love through unconscious patterns. Start loving them through conscious choices. Your shadow work is your love work. There is no more important gift you can give to those who matter most.